and we are very happy to have here Michel Pham, who's a professor of marketing at Columbia University. In fact, he's the Kravis Professor of Marketing, a former president of the Society of Consumer Psychology. Michel has a number of interests, especially in how emotion and mood influence decision-making, obviously a key topic we've already touched on. He also has some other interests. If you catch him at lunch, he talked very interestingly last year about why people post online, why do they express their likes and dislikes about so many things with such compulsion. It's a very interesting puzzle that he has some interesting answers to. He talked a lot about how emotion can sometimes be a positive force for better decision-making rather than interrupting our decision-making, and think of emotion as a positive force, which I think is also very different. So some other topics that we won't hear about, but today we're going to hear him talk about the character of brands and what makes up and more understanding of the psychology of the character of brands. Please, Michel.
Thank you very much. It's always such a great pleasure to come to this conference. I learned so much from listening to the other talks and getting an opportunity to speak to a broader audience is always something that I value very much. I'm trying to see if I can somehow get the slides to show up. So what do I do? I see it here, which is helpful to me, but not to you. OK, thank you. And so today I'm not going to talk about emotions. I'm going to talk more about the macro level. Most of the research I do has to do more about individual consumer behavior. And here I'm going to talk about more aggregate behavior and phenomena around brands and around what we call brand character. And so the topic is related to how do consumers in the marketplace perceive of brands. And by the way, I need to acknowledge that the work is with my eminent colleague, Camille Didi at Columbia, and a terrific doctoral student of mine who's going to be on the job market this summer called Travis Ho. And obviously, there's a lot of brand that exists out there. And the question is that how does the marketplace conceive of those brands? You can envision that each brand has its individual perceptions. They're all different from one another. Or more plausibly, that perhaps people somehow categorize brands and tend to perceive them along certain dimensions. And the latter hypothesis was perhaps best formalized in advance by Jennifer Archer in a very classic and influential paper that's called Brand Personality, which was published in 1997, in which Jennifer argued and proposed the idea that maybe when we think of brands, we think of a person, and they have different personalities. And she went on to document that brands have personalities that align along 5 dimensions, which are listed here: sincerity, excitement, competence, sophistication, and ruggedness. And that stuff, I assume, if you teach branding in your class, presumably that's something that you probably teach in almost every textbooks, and this has received tons of citations, and essentially was taken as the state of the art, if you will, with respect to brand personality and brand being perceived along human-like dimensions. So what I'd like to do is to say, you know what? Before we take that for granted and we accept that theory as such, there's a number of reasons why you might want to question that and sort of revisit this. And we're going to somehow raise 5 reasons why perhaps we need to have a second look at that general theory. The first reason is pretty obvious. The paper was published in 1997, which means that the data were probably collected around 1995, maybe. And so let's look at the world in 1997, what it looked like. The world in 1997 is a world in which Apple was trading at 78 cents a share. It's trading today at more than $200 a share, in which Sears was a massive Fortune 500 company, in which most of our online interface and internet access was directed by a company called America Online, and you got mail, and you got so excited back then, and there was a movie about it, and there was a kid who was learning how to code, whose name is Mark Zuckerberg, who became someone later on, and Amazon.com still use a logo around the river, okay? So that's, so the world is very different in 1997, so why would we believe that the world as it was captured by Jennifer 20 years ago plus would be the same today? That's the first reason. The second reason is that if you look at the paper, and you know, the paper was a great paper, so I'm not criticizing the work, but we need to evolve. And the universe of brands that she studied at that time was essentially 37 brands. So these are the brands that she studied at that time. And so the whole theory rests on an analysis of 37 brands. And so the question is that, is whatever happened for those 37 brands, even if you assume that the world has not changed, representative of the way consumers see the brands as of today in the broader world. The third reason you need to think about that is that, maybe brand personalities, as she measured them, doesn't matter. There's a question of materiality. How does a brand personality connect into metrics and things that we care about as marketers? And maybe it's just an epiphenomenon. We assume that it does matter. That's what we teach when we have branding classes, but maybe it does not. And this is something that was not studied in the original work. Other things that were left off the original work is that, what is a good brand personality profile? Right? Does it mean that you need to be well-rounded, which is a theory that go out now teaching executives? You need to have a well-rounded personality. But you can come out and say, no, maybe a good personality is one in which you stand out on some dimensions, and then you're okay on the other ones. Or maybe you need to stand out on 2 dimensions, not just one. Or maybe you need to be fantastic on some dimensions, in which case maybe you can afford to be terrible on other dimensions. You can come up with lots of theories that are very plausible. That would give you some answers, but we just don't know the answer. And the last thing that was left off is the fact that we just don't know category effects. Okay, so if you have 37 brands, you can't tell much about whether brand personalities matters a lot or not that much with respect to different product categories, and this is something that was not studied in the original work. So we're going to try to resolve a lot of these questions. I have a limited amount of time to share everything we have done, but I'm going to try to give you some answers that speak to those quote-unquote limitations of the original theory. And for that, we're going to be using a set of data that was given access to us by a division of Young & Rubicam called the BAV Group, and they have this very large-scale survey that they run year after year throughout the world across lots of brands. And the data that I'm going to share with you are based on an analysis over 20 years of data, okay, that involve not 37 brands, but 7,000 brands. Like lots and lots of respondents, maybe 17,000 respondents per brand on a typical survey. So we have lots of data. And not only we have data on how consumers perceive the brands, we also have data on whether they prefer the brand or not. And we're going to try to sort of see whether the perceptions of the brands do map on into preferences for the brand. To give you a sense of how the survey looked, if you want to see the behind of the scenes, and I cannot share too much, but so a respondent in a periodic survey would fill out this very long questionnaire, in which case they will have lots of brands, and then they be giving, among the many things that they respond to, they provide some kind of a rating or a check on what they call a brand attribute. For example, you might be asked whether, let me see, where's okay, whether you think the red envelope is upper class, and you might sort of check, yes, it's upper class, etc. And so that's going to be a measure we're going to be using to create some indices of brand perception, if you will. And there's also data on brand preferences that is also provided there. And so what we do is very simple, conceptually very simple. You're going to run this big factor analysis using the ratings, if you will, that we have, or perceptions of the brand on 48 dimensions, try to sort of synthesize these, and then come up to see, is there some kind of a solution that comes out of that? Is there an equilibrium in terms of how people synthesize the brands in their minds? And we find out, first of all, that it turns out that the solution is fairly robust. It sort of holds years after year, and it's a fairly simple solution. Okay? 6 factors, not 5, 6 factors account for about almost 90% of the variance in how people provide those ratings. So what are those factors? Indulge me a little bit. We're going to call them brand character because they're not exactly the same dimensions, same questions. They look a little bit like some of the terms were the same as in Jennifer Archer's original survey, but they're a bit different on some other dimensions. So we're going to call that brand character as opposed to brand personality traits, and I think it's a better terms, but we don't have the time to discuss that. Let me sort of tell you what are the 6 dimensions we identify. The first one is the one that you might call classiness. Okay, this will be reflected by people who say, you know, the brand is upper class, it's prestigious, it's glamorous, it's stylish, it's distinctive. These are the terms that people sort of use to characterize those brands. And to give you a sense of which other brands will be like that, they're very intuitive, mostly luxury brands. You'll have Rolex, Tiffany, Louis Vuitton, Ritz-Carlton. So it's so interesting to know which other brands are not considered to be classy. Okay? So brands that are not considered to be classy would be budget brands, Taco Bell, Realtor.com, Six Motel. Okay? A second dimension, which was not in the original work, that emerged essentially in the last 10 years, is the dimension that we call innovativeness. People say, you know, those brands are innovative, progressive, visionary, up-to-date. Intelligence is another term that they use to characterize those brands. And brands that are like that are the brands that you would suspect will be falling there. Think of Google, think of Apple, think of SpaceX, will be brands like that. Brands that are not innovative, also interesting. Miller High Life, Lucky Strike, the Chicago Cubs, you may have heard of those guys, and then the Bob Evans. Then you have brands, and this is one dimension that people don't speak about when they think about brands. Sometimes some of the dimensions in which consumers perceive brands is around what they call fun. Okay? Some brands are fun, some brands are not fun. Brands that are fun are characterized as charming, fun, friendly, etc. You have, like, of course, entertainment brands like Disney, Cirque du Soleil. Interestingly, YouTube is a brand that's characterized as fun. And part of the fun, which is something that Travis has a great dissertation about, is about providing a unique experience to the consumers. Part of the fun of YouTube is the fact that you have this unique experience over and over again. Brands that are not fun include Goldman Sachs, the Wall Street Journal, and you'd be surprised, but the United States Congress is not fun. Okay? But the one dimension that accounts for most of the variance, if you want to know what really makes a big difference in brand character, it's a dimension that we call trustworthiness. So people would say that brand is reliable, it's trustworthy, it's high quality, whether people somehow think that they can really depend on your brand, this is really a big driver of your character as a brand. And so they reward a lot of brands that are product functional type of brands, Band-Aid, John Deere, Ziploc, Levi's, brands that they do not trust so much, interestingly, would be like Bitcoin, Kardashian collection, Cialis, I don't know where that comes from, and then there's the dimensional daring energy, you know, so so brands that have a lot of action packed into them, so entertainment brands, sports brands, movies, action movies, Six Flags will go score high. Interestingly, brands that score poorly on daring energy will be the brands that are comfort-oriented brands, like Curel, Campbell Soup, you know, Comforting, tend to score low on the energy dimension. That sort of makes sense from a psychological standpoint. There's a dimension that is become talked about more recently is how much does the brand care? Right? Is it a caring brand? And this is something that, of course, is a hot topic because the zeitgeist of today is our brand needs to be more caring of the others, etc. And this is picked up by consumers in their aggregates around brands. Is a brand kind, socially responsible? And the non-for-profit brands tend to perform well on that. They're not the only one. Walgreens does well on that. And interestingly, what are the brands that people don't find caring? It's not necessarily the jerks. This is not the jerks. What they select are brands that where the benefit and the promise is mostly self-related. So brands where, like, think about Beats, you just put yourself, yes, this is for me, or Dyson, you reward yourself with a great vacuum cleaner. So that's really benefit for the consumer, not so much that you care about the rest of the world, right? And that tends to be brands that score poorly on that. So first of all, so we have this 6th dimension here. What do you do with that? Well, the first thing you need to know is sort of say, well, which one matters? I already gave you part of the answers. The answer is as follows. Okay, and this is interesting because it follows a geometric pattern. Okay, if you look at amount of variance explained by each of these 4 dimensions, the number one by far is trustworthiness. So the one thing you cannot shortchange your brand about is going to be trustworthiness. That accounts for 40% or so of the variance. It has been the same for the last 20 years or so. The second one, but it's a distant second one, is innovativeness. About half of that, it's around 20% or so, is the second dimension that matters a lot in shaping your character on the aggregate, right? And then it falls another half of that that would be classiness. That's not a big driver, 10% of the variance, as is fun. And then, I'm sorry for those of you who really spend so much resource on CSR, but the caring doesn't carry that much weight. Okay, about 5%, so divide again by 2, right? So you see this geometric progression in terms of how decreasing each of those things are. And if you look about 10 years before that, the pattern was the same, except there's one dimension that sort of flipped. 10 years before that, the number one was still trustworthiness. The second one, though, 10 years before that, was classiness. Classy was a good way to position your brand to, in the late 1990s, early 2000s, that has fallen down. The thing that has supplanted classiness is innovativeness. So the new luxury currency nowadays is innovation rather than classiness, if you will. Right? So now we see the character dimensions. You can sort of plot brands, how they evolve over time. You can sort of see that brands like Google had a footprint that has increased over time, so the character expanded over time, which is what you expect. Some brands like Red Bull as well, brands like Sears are shrinking in terms of character, so is BlackBerry, which is not surprising. Okay? So now next question is that, all right, so you have this character, big deal, does it matter? And the question is, yes, it does matter. If you try to sort of look at the overall height of these bars in terms of character and try to see how does that correlate with measures of brand preference, it does, okay? For most categories, it does. So you can sort of fit down some kind of a fancy model, which I cannot do, but my colleagues can. And what they find is that, what we find is that it does matter. So here's on aggregate, the brand character strength. So if you think of the size of the surface in this radial chart I showed you, and so see how does it correlate with brand preference. So this is for quick service restaurants, this is for internet, telecom, this is for airlines, this is for beer, not as strong for beer, very strong for countries. So if you think about, hey, what is the country I want to go? It's a country with character, right? So somehow that's a very strong relationship. So now some categories, it doesn't matter. Okay? So for those of you in the consulting world, do not waste your time on that dimension. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. If you're in the milk business, it doesn't matter. If you're in bottled water, it doesn't matter. Okay? So there are a few categories for which it doesn't matter, but it does matter for most of the categories. All right. So now, which one of the dimensions matter? Right? Because presumably, so if I am a beer company, or if I am a sports company, or if I am a drugstore, which are the ones that I need to focus on? So I gave you already a hint. In terms of brand preference, trust, so this is a chart. Let me sort of show you how it looks. These are models, these are regression coefficients of how much your brand preference increase as a function of how high you score on a dimension, right? So on trustworthiness, the more you are trustworthy, how much actually does that help you increase in terms of preference? And the dotted line telling you it has no impact. To the right of that line, we mean it has a positive impact. To the left of that line, it means it has a negative impact. And the one thing that helps you all the time, and very strongly so, is going to be trustworthiness. The one thing you cannot afford not to have is really trustworthiness. You could sort of see that it never hurts you to be a more trustworthy brand in terms of character. It's not so true for other dimensions, okay? So innovativeness tends to help you. You can sort of see that across categories, it does help you, but you can see that for some categories, quite a few, doesn't really matter. For some of them, it hurts you. You know, if you're selling beverage, beer, innovation hurts you, I don't want you to be an innovation brand if you are, that's what our consumers are, the consumers are saying, if you are a beverage brand, alcoholic brand, or if you're a non-for-profit brand, or if you're a sports brand, okay? Fun, you can sort of see, it helps on one dimension, it doesn't help on other dimensions. So if I go through each of these, you can see that there's quite a bit of variability in some of the brands, like classiness, the things that we say, oh, you know, I always want to be more upscale. It turns out that it's more likely to hurt you. You know, if you pick to use your character around the classiness dimension in the wrong set of categories, which is a lot of the categories you see right here, okay? Let me sort of conclude here by sort of remind you of a few things. First of all, I think it's time to update our theory of brand personality. I think we need to somehow modernize a bit our conceptions of that. And the more modern view that is more comprehensive is what we call brand character, that has 6 dimensions: trustworthiness, innovativeness, classiness, fun, daring, energy, and caring. Okay? We need to keep in mind that they have a prioritization to think about this dimensional character in terms of how much they shape, how the marketplace sees you as a brand. Trustworthiness is by far the most important, and then half of that will be for innovativeness. You cut by half, and then you fall into the realm of where you can play with fun and classiness, and then sadly, perhaps for some of you, it's daring energy and caring would be even less than that. The brand character does matter, so you should not ignore it because it does predict brand preference, and in fact, you find some dimension, it's going to always help you in general if you can build up your character level in terms of increasing your brand preference for most categories, unless you are consulting, water, etc. There are a few categories for which it doesn't matter. And but then, of course, you have to pick very carefully which dimension you want to invest in. Clearly, trustworthiness is one that is always going to help you, and then you have to be, depending on your category, focusing on some other dimensions, perhaps. The one thing that I did not share the data with, but we will also analyze, is that what kind of profiles people like in terms of saying, you know, I love this brand or not. They tend to like brands that have 1 or 2 peaks. So there's one dimension that stands out, maybe 2. These are the ones that do better rather than the brands that are sort of more average and more balanced. Okay, that's what I had to share with you, and I'm happy to entertain some questions. Yes, sir. Yeah, Matt.
Okay, there. So some of this it could be related to basically having a baseline of need for trustworthiness. For instance, so if I think of telecom companies and, you know, trustworthiness or reliability maybe is at a premium, I am worried about their reliability, so any movement for that company is great movement, right? Up toward greater reliability. But other times you might pick up on just a restricted range. So in other words, everyone in this category has to be fun, and therefore, you know, you have to be there. And if you're not, that's a problem, but most people are there, so there's a restricted range. So in other words, some of these could be due to, like, you have to be fun. If you're not, okay, that's a problem, but most people are fun. Whereas in telecom, there's more of a range that you can grow into as a trustworthy brand. Is that an accurate understanding of the data?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure actually that this is really what the data is showing us. And so what we also do those analysis that you can see, and I went a little fast, is the fact that we also did this analysis categories by categories, right? And in all categories, you can sort of see that trustworthiness really matters. And across categories, of course, there's variability in terms of the means and the range that in which the brands score, so that doesn't seem to be what explain why trustworthiness matter more. I think it's really more substantive reasons that the marketplace rewards brands along something that they can depend on. I mean, that's what the brand is. If you go back to the origin of a brand, the brand is meant to be an assurance that of a promise you provide in the marketplace. Yes, sir. Yeah.
Really good background. I love the fact that you're willing to challenge very...
Sorry, I'm having trouble with the connection.
It's a terrible question.
Okay.
I love the fact that you're willing to challenge traditional marketing thinking, which is really cool. I think as the world changes, we need to continue to update our view of the world. The question I have for you is, Jim Stengel did a ton of work in his book about how brands grow around, and his conclusions were very similar to yours around trust is the key driver of current brand performance. The one question I have for you, though, is one of the findings he came up with is innovation might not be the biggest indicator of current success, but it is by far the greatest driver of future brand value creation, future brand growth. So being seen as dynamic, differentiated in much of your innovation dimension. Have you at all looked at this not just as a fixed effect point in time analytics, but looking at the same brands over time? Because you've got 10 years worth of data, and being familiar with VAV, they track the same brands.
So there's, we in fact have 20 years of data. It's a great question. We have not. So our analysis is cross-sectional. I think there's two levels at which the notion of innovation can be looked at. So we're looking at innovation, the way we capture it is innovation as being perceived by the consumers, just right? And I can imagine that from a business standpoint, innovation can make a lot of sense without necessarily be the thing that you market. If you think about a company that's terrifically innovative is Domino's Pizzas. Now, Domino's Pizza innovate tremendously on technology. So from the way you can order a pizza on your mobile phone using text messages, I can order a pizza in 2 clicks. And terrifically innovative company that would not be reflected in how the market perceive it. You see, and so I think there's innovation. What I mean in terms of perceptions of the brand, pizza, I would not think of pizza as being, So I was so there's one, but I do believe that so what we capture is more brand perceptions, not necessarily actually business innovation there. So but we have not modeled the brands over time, and I think it will be very useful. And that's this is really essentially our first cut into the data. And it's a great one to go. I'm allowed to take one more question apparently. Yes, sir.
Very interesting. Thank you. I was wondering how age demographics will continue to impact these insights, especially with the definition of trust being almost at odds with each other. Baby boomers likely to buy insurance from 100-year-old firms. Millennials are more likely to buy insurance from a company called Lemonade. Thank you for the. We can, if we negotiate well with the company, we can probably address that question. What it would require is that we slice our data by potential demographics. They've asked us to be very selective about the hypothesis we want to test with that. But if one thing that had been in the back of our minds to do a cohort analysis is it true across different age groups that you have the same representations of brand? It seems from how stable things are over time that doesn't seem to change much. So that would be a hint that it's quite stable. But clearly we could be testing that more directly. Okay. Sorry I couldn't take more, but I'm happy to chat some more after the sessions.